He's been the owner since 2016. He's obviously going to talk about composting, a little bit about what the universal advantages of composting are, and then more specifically how and what Veterans Compost does. Holy Trinity, I guess, has been using Veterans Compost to compost for what, a year and a half, 2 years now, Ashley? That sound right? 2 years. So Fritz, take it away.
Okay, hi, my name is Fritz Goschalk, and I'm happy to be here talking to the folks at Holy Trinity. One of the funnest things that we normally do is go to Holy Trinity School and pick up the food scraps at the cafeteria. If the kids are there, they all love talking about compost. They've actually come out to the farm a couple of times to talk to us about composting as well. So what John has asked me to do is talk a little bit about composting, its benefits, and what we do here at Veteran Compost DC. Are the slides up, Ashley? Okay, great. That's actually one of our farms in Fairfax County. That's where we produce compost. That's where the 2 6th grade classes have come out to talk to us about composting. And they had a great time both times that they've been out there. If you take a look at the slide, you can see basically how we produce compost. All the food scraps, specifically the food scraps from Holy Trinity or collected from around the DC metro area, are mixed with some of the wood chips that you see in the very front, on the front left-hand side towards the bottom of the slide. Those are mixed in a proportionary amount and put into one of our aerated static piles, which we pump oxygen into. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go in through the slide presentation. It takes us about 3 to 6 months to turn a bucket of food scraps into compost. It's a beautiful dark black brown humus or humus type of material. If we go to the next slide, Ashley. Okay, John asked me to talk specifically about why compost and its environmental benefits. And I'm sure you guys are on the green team, so you pretty much understand greenhouse gases, methane, and that. What compost does is it takes food scraps out of a waste stream. And when it takes the food scraps out of the waste stream, it reduces the amount of greenhouse gases produced by that waste stream. For every pound of food scraps that is composted, that's a pound of methane, which is about 20 times more powerful than CO2, about a pound of methane that is taken out of the environment and doesn't escape as a greenhouse gas. So it's one of the simplest, easiest, and best ways from a food perspective and an agricultural perspective to reduce the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And it does that through several different ways. It's not a straight, 1 pound for 1 pound, but there's a couple different ways where it comes into. It takes those food scraps and it turns it into a beneficial agricultural product, compost, which has it has 3 to 8 years of life, 3 to 8 years of benefit in the soil. So we talked a little bit about the greenhouse gas and methane emission. When you throw food scraps into a landfill and cover it up, when those food scraps break down, the types of microorganisms that break down those food scraps produce methane. So basically, as they eat, just like everybody, but nobody wants to admit it, they're farting, and they fart out methane. But when you compost using our system, which is an aerobic system, which pumps oxygen into the system, the types of microorganisms that we attract produce less methane. So that's where you get a lot of the methane emissions reductions. It's just through the use of the aerated static pile and adding oxygen into the system. Once compost is produced and applied to soil, it helps soils hold and sequester carbon dioxide just through the process. So that carbon that we mix with our food scraps gets put back into the soil, and through the chemical process that locks the carbon dioxide back into the soil, as well as locking the carbon back into the soil. Compost revitalizes exhausted farm soils. When we started working with a farm in Fairfax County, the soil was the bright red clay that everybody is used to seeing in the DC metro area, because all the topsoil and all the organic matter had been scraped away and taken away. When you add compost, it returns the organic matter back into the soil, and it revitalizes the soil through 2 or 3 different ways. The most important way, and this is what the science is really starting to bear out, is it increases the microbial activity in soil. Those microbes that are in compost, that are actively eating the food scraps, eating the carbon, and pooping out whatever they poop out, they get back into the soil. They continue to circulate through the soil, and as they eat the organic matter, their waste is exactly what a plant wants to eat. So you see very, very strong plants. Compost does replace trace minerals and organic matter back into the soil. Trace minerals are less important than the organic matter, and it makes stronger, much more productive plants. A stronger plant is going to be able to do 2 or 3 different things. First of all, a stronger plant is going to be able to resist pests, different types of bugs that would eat on the plant. A stronger plant is going to produce more fruits, of course. And most importantly, a stronger plant is going to suck out more CO2 out of the atmosphere, once again, contributing to that CO2 greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It's the kind of the beauty of the composting process. Through its natural chemical process, compost helps reduce erosion by holding more water in the soil. It also prevents stormwater runoff, which is prevalent in this area. So the compost, just because it's much more open, it allows the hydrogen, oxygen atoms, oxygen molecules to bond with the carbon atoms molecules much easier through cation action. On a more down to earth, less sciencey type of thing, a lot of organizations and corporations, they have environmental goals. Composting is one of the best ways to reduce that. When you look at your waste stream, the heaviest stuff that you put into your waste stream is food scraps. And if you're able to reduce the amount of waste that you're producing by pound for pound, food scraps is the best to do it. And to be honest, it's kind of fun. That's what has attracted me to composting, outside of the environmental benefits and everything else. It's kind of fun to watch. Are there any questions about this slide?
Fred, I had asked people to hold the questions till the end. Is that okay with you, or do you want to ask as they go?
Asking as they go kind of sparks a few more questions,
Okay.
just because they see it right in front of them. So if anybody has any questions about this, I'm happy to talk more about it.
Yep, that's relevant. Microbes. What kind of microbes are we even? We're muted, aren't we? No, we're not. We are? Oh, what about the microbes? What kind of microbes?
I'm hearing a question about what kind of microbes.
Yeah.
There are billions and billions and billions of microbes, so it's kind of tough to talk about specific ones, but I know we have a great deal of mycelial activity, and you can see it as our composting process happens. When you pick up a handful of compost that's been screened, you'll see a white chalky substance on the outside of some of the carbon molecules. That's mycelial activity. It's one of the basic microorganisms that we do see in our compost. The science behind microorganism studies is way behind a lot of other sciences. So there's not a whole lot of, it's type A, type B, type C microorganisms that are kind of out there. We just know that there's a lot of microorganic bacterial activity in there. Mycelium is something that we do see a great deal of.
Fritz, do you have any idea how much composting is going on in the United States? I mean, how many people or how many companies are composting their waste?
Well, that's a That's a big question. I do not know in the United States. I do know, in the DC metro area, we, between Veteran Compost DC and Veteran Compost Baltimore, we produce 10,000 yards of compost per year, and we're considered very small facilities.
Wow.
10,000 yards of compost. So that's probably 50,000 tons of food scraps from the DC metro area that are, that DC and Baltimore metro areas that are compost by our company. I do know that the city of San Francisco, the Bay Area, and Seattle are 400 tons of food scraps per day. So that's, that's another 120,000 tons of food scraps there. But those are the two big municipalities that I do know compost. There are some other smaller municipalities that do offer composting services, like in upstate New York and some of the northeastern municipalities. But it's not as common as I would hope it would be.
Yeah. So it looks like we have plenty of room for growth.
Oh yeah, finding food scraps is never a problem.
So Fritz, are you going to tell us what food scraps are good for composting and what are not?
Any food scrap is just fine for composting in our system. We're composting in the middle of farms where nobody cares about what is attracted to our compost piles. If you're composting in your backyard, your neighbors will care about what is attracted to your compost pile. So most municipalities recommend that you don't compost meats and grains in your backyard. Meats, as they break down, the CO2 from the meats breaking down attracts a great deal of flies, and you've probably noticed that. And grains will attract rodents, mice, rats, possums, and raccoons. So if you do that in your backyard and you don't like your neighbors, that's a good thing to do. But if you do like your neighbors, just stick with the fruits and vegetable scraps, and that you should be just fine. Eggshells are okay too.
Thank you.
But we're out in the middle of nowhere, so if there's another mouse or something in the compost pile, it's not a big deal.
Fritz, someone asked if there's a benefit to using a company like Veterans rather than purchasing your own composter or doing it at home.
Composting at home, I do that myself. I don't use our service. But I've been composting at home for 10 years now. It's a lot of fun. You get to know your worms really well. It's the same benefit that you would get from going to the farmer's market and buying local produce. You're buying from a local company. That local company can stand behind their product and tell you, this is exactly what we make our compost out of. A lot of larger organizations, the municipality up in PG County, they take in a lot of yard waste. So they might have some sort of minor contamination from the yard waste just because they're so big that they can't really notice it. We're a smaller company. We strive to make as close to organic as we can possibly be, and we love standing behind our product.
What kind of advice would you give to somebody who's just getting started composting in their yard?
If you're composting in your backyard, the number one problem is always not enough carbon in your mix, not enough browns in your mix. That's wood chips, ground up leaves, shredded paper, ground up cardboard, sawdust, that type of stuff. What we normally will see, or people ask us questions about, is they'll start off their question with, my compost is a mess. I'll say, is it a wet, smelly mess that smells like ammonia? And they'll say, yes. How'd you know? Well, you probably don't have enough carbon in there, and it's just not enough carbon to soak up the moisture and also balance out the great deal of nitrogen that you're putting into your compost. You have to have at least 2 to 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if you're dumping in a gallon of food scraps, you got to dump in at least 2 to 3 gallons of wood chips or shredded leaves or something into your system, or else you're just you're not going to achieve the correct balance chemically, and your system will break down anaerobically. When it breaks down anaerobically, that's where you get that heavy ammonia smell that smells like ammonia, rotten eggs, rotten garbage. So it's use a lot of carbon. you can't use enough carbon in a backyard system. All right,
Fritz, what is your, do you have a sense of why more people don't compost at home or in apartment buildings or even commercially?
What I suspect is, well, there's a couple things. Number one, it's not easy to do. It's not something that in the United States is prevalent. In 30 years, it will be at the same spot the recycling was 30 years ago. You know, nobody really separated their trash 30 years ago, but now they do. So when it becomes more popular, more prevalent, and folks start paying closer attention to the environment, and they realize that, you know, putting a pound of coffee grounds down the drain is putting a pound of methane into the environment, then they'll start to pick up on that. But it's just not it's an education thing. It's not popular, and also it costs money. There aren't a lot of systems. There aren't a lot of facilities for composting. So it's not, it hasn't reached the mass level where they can offer a scale price for this type of service or this type of product.
If you list residential food scrap collection, I live in a condo.
Okay.
Can you come to my condo and pick up my food scraps?
Yeah, we can. And it depends on, we work in, I want to say about 40 or 50 different condo or apartment buildings in the DC metro area, probably 60 or 70. And it's various ways to do it. You sign up for our service, but before you sign up for our service, we ask you to talk to your condo board or your apartment managers and say, hey, I'm planning on doing this. It's with Veteran Compost. This is what they do. We bring you a fresh, clean bin every week. We can either, if they give us permission, come straight up to your condo or apartment door and pick up your food scraps there and leave you a clean bin on your doorstep. Or some condos want us to do it at the concierge desk, and some condos want us to do it outside, either on the loading dock or in a discrete area outside the building. It just comes down to what your building will allow and what your manager will do. And if you're interested in it, just send me an email and I'll send you some points that we send to our condo and apartment folks who want to compost with us. It talks about some of the benefits and just some of the guarantees that we make. Like our bins normally don't smell if you keep the lids locked and you keep it in a climate controlled area for a week. It shouldn't be a problem. We don't attract pests. We don't attract rodents. We actually reduce the amount of pests and rodents because we're taking food scraps out of the normal trash system. So we can work with most any type of resident or commercial facility.
Okay, and somewhere or other we'll get your email address, right?
Just as I was going through the slides right before that, I realized I don't have my email address anywhere on the slide, but both John and Ashley have that, and I'm sure they could send it out, or you might even see it down at the bottom of the slides. It's just fritz@veterancompost.com.
I shared it in the chat now too, but we'll send it out to everyone as well.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks, Ashley.
Can I follow up on Suzanne's question? Living in a condo, what about these new machines that I've just become aware of that you literally do the whole thing inside your building and with electricity?
We've seen those, and one of our fellow composters is promoting those in the DC area. They work just fine, but there's always one or two things that you have to be well aware of. Number one, those are going to produce some sort of wastewater or leachate. So if it's just sitting in your basement somewhere, there's got to be a pipe going into your sewer system that allows that leachate to be diverted into the waste stream. The other thing is it's a machine. When that machine breaks, there's got to be somebody that will come out and fix it, which is sometimes can be a challenge because it comes down to, you buy the machine and then if it breaks, then you got to call the company and that type of stuff. We use a very simple process. Aerated static pile is nothing more than building our windrows correctly, running a pipe through it and pumping our air in there. It's a very easy, simple method that we've been working. But the machines, we've seen them. We know they work. I just kind of shake my head as to who's going to maintain that, and when the mess comes in or somebody doesn't quite use the machine quite properly, who's gonna clean it up. But they do work.
The products that I've seen, in 3 or 4 hours after you've plugged it in and run, it creates some kind of material that you just take out then and dump on your plants outside.
Yeah, that might be a bit optimistic.
Vitamix makes one, and somebody else named Cycler makes one.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with them, but it's a chemical process that it takes. It does take time to actually allow the microorganisms to go out there and do what they do. If it's 3 to 4 days, my hat's off to them. They figured out how to beat the science.
It's Ellen Barlow here. In response to John's question of why aren't more people composting, the building where I live is currently considering, it's a co-op in Northwest DC, currently considering a building-wide composting program. And the initial response back from the board is, what about the odor, and how do you collect it in your apartment? So it's like, oh boy, that's kind of preliminary and basic. But that's the first feedback, was odor, and how do you collect it inside your apartment? Well, I mean, I've been doing it now for a while, and I simply use a little plastic container that I get some fruit or cherry tomatoes in, and pop my fruit scraps into that on the countertop, and then pop it in the refrigerator into a plastic bag, and then put it in the freezer, and I'm ready to take it to wherever it's going to go in. In this case, I'm bringing it to farmers markets because I don't know where else to bring it. So it's not hard, but it just seems not hard, but you have to it's like any new habit. And the other thing I'll say is, in terms of the progression, is, first, it's kind of daunting to think 30 years. Oh, that's a long time away. But really, I know that I lived on a farm once when I was a young woman, and you just composted because there was a garden. That's what you did. But if you lived in the suburbs, you didn't compost, because what were you going to do with it? Oh, you could compost. Oh, but then there's the foxes and the deer. And so you have to be much smarter about it in the suburbs. And now I am in the city, and there's just no way I want to contribute to the methane in the out of the landfills. So it's a pretty obvious move for all of us to make a small contribution. And it's going to take my building some time, apparently, to do a poll to see if everybody wants to participate. I'm thinking, I think I'll get my own bid in the meantime.
Yeah, the 30 years I talk about, if you look at San Francisco City in the state of California, it was 1981 when they came out with their first waste reduction plan. And it was a scaled, by 1985, we want to be at 10%. By year 2000, we want to be at 85% waste diverted away from the landfill. So, they laid that out in the early 80s, and it wasn't until 2005, 2006 that they were able to get the composting system at the level that they were able to divert, I want to say 75 or 80% of their waste from the landfill to either recycling or to a composting facility. So it's, even in very progressive, highly educated cities, DC is a progressive, highly educated city. It's not something that's going to be easy to embrace, and it's just not going to be very quick. There's a lot of will to do it. It's there's just very small pockets of that will. Okay, if there's no more questions about that, I'll go on to my next slide. Just talk a little bit about veteran compost. My business partner, Justin, he came back from Iraq in 2010, and he wanted to do something in the green world. He couldn't find a very good job, so he went to grad school, got his MBA, studied organic composting, and came across that and said, well, this is what my business is going to be. So he started in July 2010. He produces, like I say, 10,000 yards of compost per year, and he takes about, we take 20 tons of food scraps per week in Fairfax County, he takes 20 tons per day. So there's just a much larger facility up there. We're trying to develop a third facility in Lothian, Maryland. And we're running into zoning and permitting issues there. We're working through those processes, but that's been a 3-year process there. In DC, we have 11 full-time, 3 part-time employees. These are full-up employees. They receive the full federally mandated benefits and some of the state mandated benefits, unemployment insurance, paid family leave, that type of stuff. And that's what we produce down there at the bottom. We produce a whole range of compost and composting products, and we offer commercial food scrap collection and residential food scrap collection. Just as an interest, we're getting way up there. Just as an interest, Ashley, you want me to go faster? As an interest, I have 14 employees. 2 of my employees are, actually 3 of my employees are not veterans. The other 11 are veterans. One of my guys, he was making $6.75 an hour. Now he's making $16 an hour. So they're all fairly happy folks. Okay, now Ashley, I'm good. Our main facility up in Aberdeen, Maryland. This is where 20 tons of food scraps per day are composted. It's a much larger facility than our Fairfax County facility. If you see that picture at the top, you see those different piles at the bottom. Each of those piles has a blower blowing oxygen into it. Those are about 40 feet long, about 20 feet wide, and each of those dots in the middle of the row is a blower, and that's what blows into our system. The nitrogen from the food scraps plus the carbon from the wood chips plus the oxygen is what attracts the microbial activity and enhances it. Microbes want to eat nitrogen and carbon, and they want to breathe and drink water just like everybody else. So the moisture from the food scraps, nitrogen from the food scraps, and the carbon is what they gives them a good home to eat. And as they're eating, whatever they're pooping out is what plants want to eat. He uses my partner up in Aberdeen. He's got a 30-acre farm, positive aerated static pile. He's got about 1 million worms working up there for him, making worm castings. And if anybody's an organic gardener, you know the power of worm castings. Our second facility, it's in Mount Vernon, Virginia. It's actually part of the Historic Woodlawn Trust, which, if you're familiar with that, is one of the 5 farms that George Washington originally started. So it's kind of a cool thing. We're partnered with Arcadia Farm, which runs a veteran agricultural program, veteran training and agricultural program. We use the same system, just on a much smaller field. And most of our compost goes either to our worms or straight to the farm. We guarantee if it's compostable, we're going to compost it. Meats, grains, dairy products, no problem. If you are into, like the school there, they use compostable service items. The plates the trays they use and the flatware they use, we compost that. Napkins and bowls, anything that is clearly marked as compostable. We get pretty good feedback to the customers. We talk to them about their weights and composted volume, as well as their contamination rate. Very responsive, friendly customer service. We never use a subcontractor, and all my employees are earning well above what the city of DC determines to be a living wage. And we actually started an IRA employer matched retirement program for them. This is the heart of the business, collecting food scraps. Food scraps are mixed with a carbon source, form them into windrows, put them on top of that pipe, blow some oxygen into it. And in 3 to 5 weeks, they are taken off of the windrow. Then they're screened, and they need to cure for 3 to 6 months, or compost needs to cure for 3 to 6 months before it can be considered a finished product. And it's basically, when you put it onto the windrow and you start pumping oxygen in there, our system produces heat just from the aerobic activity of the microbes. That heat translates to about 140 to 160 degrees. So when we screen it, every time we move it, it gets reoxygenated, so it heats back up. Every time we move it around, the temperature will spike back up. You have to allow the compost to cool down to the point that it's plus or minus 10 degrees from ambient air temperature. and then you can plant seeds or plants into it. If you plant it too early in there, you'll burn your seed or your plant. So that's why we want to let it cure for 3 to 6 months before we market it. Compost goes straight to the farm fields. Most of the farmers that we work with start every one of their plants in our compost. So it starts its life in a very happy microbially rich spot. The farmers apply more compost to the fields as they plant it. And as that cycle continues, as more plants are put in there, more compost is applied, it just makes the soil much more productive. We also apply it to pastures to make the pastures more productive from a grazing perspective. Next slide. What makes composting a challenge? It's just the level of contamination that we see. This was taken out of, this was not Holy Trinity. Holy Trinity, it's normally ketchup packets or hot sauce packets that we find, or an occasional milk jug in the bin. But you know, from an office, we'll get a lot of coffee creamer things. We'll get coffee cups, drinking cups, plastic, silverware, Coke cans, all kinds of stuff in there. We have to separate out just to keep the plastic contamination level down. And this is one of the challenging educational aspects of it. When we start working with a new customer or a new client, we give them very good feedback, because we don't want them putting that plastic into our system, because A, we have to pick it out, and B, if it gets through our screening process, then that plastic is returned to the soil, and it just contributes more to the plastic that's coming into our food stream. I think that's the last slide I've got. Yep. That's my partner Justin there on his out on his farm. Standing on pile of his feet are probably kind of warm there. But yeah, that's what we got. Any questions?
If I could, and this is kind of a show and tell. Ellen, you asked what do you do when you compost? We have this little bin at home, and it sits on our countertop. So this is what we put our scraps into, and then we have a bin outside that we dump it into. It's a five gallon bin. We use a competitor of Veterans Compost, but after this, we may even switch. I don't know. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, there's some questions that were in the chat that you maybe can't see, Fritz. What is the monthly cost for residents in DC?
For residents in DC, we charge $29 per month, which I think is the lowest price in the district. For that price, once a week we come to your house with a freshly cleaned bin with a fresh liner in it. We take your full bin away, leave you the clean bin. Your bin gets taken out to our farm. The food scraps get added to our composting system. Your bin gets washed, dried, prepped for the next customer. I think
maybe we can negotiate a Holy Trinity new customer discount. So
you guys are all in the a very close area together. Yeah, we can work on something like that.
Someone else asked, can you explain how worms and centipedes fit in?
Yes, I can. Worms. We use our worms, just regular red wiggler worms. It's actually one of the most entertaining activities there are, because, like I said, you get to know your worms really well. But the worms, we feed our worms. First of all, we go when we pick up thousands of red wiggler worms, put them in a bin, and we feed them raw compost. The worms love it. We give them water every week. We feed them every week. As they are circulating through that compost, eating and pooping, their poop is what organic gardeners love. Worm castings is one of the things that they really want. It's one of those things you kind of got to get used to. As a worm is eating the compost, as it passes through its digestive tract, it picks up 3 times the amount of microbial activity than it would with just regular compost. The more scientists that look at compost, soil activity, and soil benefits, they're starting to realize that it's not necessarily the chemicals from compost that are going back into the soil, but it's the microbial activity that's going back into the soil that folks want to get into the compost. So it's not necessarily the trace amount of nitrogen or carbon or potassium that's going in there. It's the huge amount of microbial activity. And when a worm eats something and passes it through its digestive tract, it just picks up 3 times the amount of microbial activity than regular compost. So it's just a very microbially dense substance. So when you get that into your soil, it just makes your soil that much better and that much more productive. Centipedes are the enemy because they actually eat worms. So when we see a centipede, we pull it out of our worm bin because I don't want it eating the worms or the worm eggs, because those worms are, from a business perspective, making me a lot of money.
Matt has a question.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I wrote, how is the compost delivered? Do you deliver it in bulk or in bags or both ways? You mentioned farmers, so I assume you're putting that on the truck, but do you sell anything in bags?
Yeah, we do both. Most of our farmers in the DC, Baltimore, Aberdeen, Annapolis area, they want, yard or 10 yards or dump truck load of compost. Here in the DC metro area, we do sell it by the bag, by the cubic foot bag. You send me an email, tell me how many bags you want, and we'll get that put together and available for pickup within 3 to 5 days.
Hi, this is Yolanda. I'd like to know if, in addition to collection of compost in the neighborhoods, do you work with grocery stores like those that are in the neighborhood, Safeway, Walmart, Trader Joe?
We work with Mom's Market, if you're familiar with them. And then we also work with Good Food Grocery in Northeast DC. Most large branch grocery stores that you see in the district, they don't really have an environmental mandate. So that's not something that they're quite interested in. And, we provide a service, so it actually costs money. Some folks just don't want to pay for that to be hauled away.
So this is a question for John. Is it possible that the green team could work on that?
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great idea. I think that's an action we can take, right?
Right. And we have the person who could collect it. So I think it would be a win-win deal, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Fritz,
Other questions?
yeah, Matt asked, are you aware if there are any organic bagging systems? It was a follow-up question.
Organic, not quite sure.
Bagging systems?
I'll give it my best guess. Organic compost is very difficult to get certified to make organic compost. And that comes down to plastics and polylactic acids, which is what makes a lot of the service items that you see, the silverware, compostable cups, it's all made out of polylactic acids from cornstarch or other sugars. Our system, if somebody goes to the effort to purchase very expensive compostable silverware because they want it composted, we'll compost it for them. But that detracts from our ability to become certified as certified organic as far as compost goes. It's also a very expensive certification process. There are companies and organizations that will do that, and you'll see a pretty good price difference between organic compost and what we produce. We think our compost is pretty good without the certification, but I do understand why folks would want that.
Matt, I'm sorry, Fritz. Are all your composting worms red wiggler worms?
That's the preferred worm. Those worms, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they are eating and pooping. Earthworms are lazy, lazy, lazy worms. They go to the bottom of the bin, they just sit there and they wait for things to come to them. That's probably why they're so big. But if you get a good group of red wigglers in there, you're going to do great as far as worm casting goes. If you have a backyard composting bin or a composting system, I always tell people, the first day after the earliest spring rain, when all the worms are on the sidewalk, those are mostly red wigglers here in the DC metro area. Just go pick those up, put them in a cup, throw them in your compost bin, and they will be there forever. A worm colony will grow or shrink based off of the food and space that they have. So if you have plenty of food in your bin and plenty of space, that colony will become big enough to sustain itself in the bin. If you don't have enough food or space, that colony will lay a bunch of eggs and shrink so that they don't overpopulate their colony.
So where would, one person asked where you would get red wiggler worms?
You can buy them online, or like I said, the first rain after spring, just go around with a Dixie cup or a Coca-Cola cup or something and just pick them up off the sidewalk. That's where I got my colony of worms that I have in my backyard, and I have not gone and picked up any more since.
And when the compost is ready, how do you separate the worms, one by one, or what do you do?
We have a trommel screener. It's about a 1/8 quarter-inch to 1/8 screener, and we'll put the worm castings and the worms through the screener. Worms get bounced out one side, and the worm castings go out the bottom side, and then we got somebody standing there just to make sure we don't put too many worms into our worm castings.
And then one other question is, what is your mix of business between residential, business, and schools?
We don't have, well, that's a great question. You know, when you're at the Pentagon and you're briefing a bunch of generals and somebody asks you a question that you don't really have at the moment for an answer for, you just say, "Hey, that's a great question, sir. Let me talk to my friends about that." Most of our business, 40% of our business is residential food scrap collection. About 40% is commercial food scrap collection, and those unfortunately are all shut down right now. About 20% is our small schools. We have about 4 or 5 small schools here in the DC metro area that we work with. But then we also compost all 3 of the dining facilities at George Mason University. So that's where I get the rest of the school food scraps from. If you guys can just let me pause for just a second. My doorbell rang a couple minutes ago. I just got to make sure there's nobody standing there. Amazon.
Oh, great. Fritz, this is kind of a related set of questions. So in our neighborhood, one of your competitors' price is $32 a month for this relatively the same service, you know, picking up and delivering and so forth. But we only pay half that because there's a good number of customers in the neighborhood. So questions, let's assume for the sake of argument that Holy Trinity became a promoter of your business throughout a bunch of neighborhoods in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Would you be willing to sit down and negotiate price?
I can, but you have to recognize that there's some differences between our business models between us and our competitors. Our competitors, they use a lot of contract labor, meaning that when I pay an employee 15, or actually I pay mine an average of $17 an hour. When I pay them $17 an hour, I'm actually paying them $25 an hour because there's the federal taxes and all that type of stuff. So my labor costs are a little bit higher. If I just contracted, I would just pay them $17 an hour, and they would be responsible for their taxes. They also don't own their vehicles, and they also don't produce compost, so they don't have my overhead. In addition, there's one other thing. They don't clean the bins. We take our bins out to the farm every time we pick them up, and we wash them out, soap, water, and rinse them again. But I'd be happy to sit there, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and negotiate a price with you. You know, I do that in we got a couple of smaller neighborhoods and apartment buildings that we've got several customers in, and we do give them a discount over our rate.
Okay.
Fritz, I think one model we had talked about, and it's hard right now because the campus is closed, but you know, if we had a dedicated bin that parishioners brought in their own composting, you know, kind of what you do for the school, you know, could that be a model where you picked up a larger bin of scraps and composting that parishioners brought in?
I'd be happy to do that. We do that with a couple different condominium buildings where they have a green team inside the condo association. I think the green team members pay a small fee towards that bin, and the condo throws in a little bit of money towards it too. And they just, you know, once a week they put their food scraps out there. We come by, pick them up, and that's that. So that'd be very easy to do.
So for those people who are on the call who don't compost, would Ashley's idea appeal to you? So let's say you had one of these little bins at home and you put your compost in there and maybe brought your compost to church once we go back to church, and deposit your compost in this great big bin. I don't know, we'd have to work out some kind of a fee arrangement. I'm not sure how we do that. We haven't figured that out yet, but would that appeal to you? Okay, well, maybe once we get back, Ashley, we'll try and work something out.
Going back to church is the issue.
I know, yes, that's true, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, the school plans right now to be open in September. So, I mean, if Fritz is picking up from the school, then, you know, there's ways that if people are willing to drive into Georgetown that we can try to make it available, since he's picking up 2 days a week anyway. I'm assuming that's going to continue.
That's good. That's good news. Any other thoughts or questions?
Fritz, this is Sarah. I have a home compost and I'm seeing more and more crows around in my trees. Do you think that's because of my composting, and what do I do to get rid of those?
Well, there's a couple ways you can take care of that, but crows are attracted to compost. Are you composting any sort of meats or anything like that?
No.
That's odd.
I don't actually see them in the compost, but it just seems like there's more in our trees than there used to be.
Yeah, there could be a correlation there. I'm not going to say for sure, but just to keep your neighborhood peace alive, it could be. There are a lot of crows that have come to our system. Annoyingly, what they'll do is they'll pick up something that's in a bag, in a compostable bag in our pile, and they'll fly away and they'll leave litter all along there. So the farmer gets mad about the litter. But if you want to avoid that, you can use a closed system like a compost tumbler that has a lid on it that's closed up. If you have an open compost pile, I would recommend putting more wood chips over the top of it to make it more difficult for the crow to get down in there. You could also put some chicken wire over the top of it, or some sort of netting over the top of it that will deter the crows from landing there and rooting through it as much as they normally do, because they're like everything, they want to eat the easiest food possible. So the more difficult you make it, the less chance that they will be there to eat your compost. But it's all part of nature, so yeah.
Thanks.
I have a question. We've been composting for 4 years, and most of the time it seems to work great. However, sometimes we have volunteers that come up, we assume, from the compost. Is that, like occasionally tomatoes, and we've had problems with pumpkins actually taking over our vegetable garden. Is that because the compost wasn't ready?
Let me just formulate that answer. Most backyard composting systems, it's a temperature thing. Most backyard composting systems will only get up to about 110, maybe up to 130 degrees as they're going through their process. So you might not have enough mass to insulate to get that temperature up there. But yes, those seeds, those volunteers are coming from your compost. commercial compost, industrial compost, the stuff that we make, it reaches a temperature of 140 to 160 degrees, which is sufficient to kill off seeds. So we don't see volunteers from our compost. So you might see volunteers every now and then, and it's just a matter of when that pumpkin seed starts to germinate and you start to see it, you just got to pull it up and take it out of there, unless you want a lot of pumpkins. The tomato seeds, that's one of the hardiest seeds around, so it's one of the more difficult ones to get rid of. I get them in my home compost all the time, and I just pull the tomatoes out, and if I don't want them in there. But yeah, those volunteers are coming from your compost, and it's just a matter of the science behind it. Backyard systems don't heat up enough to kill off those weed seeds.
I would suggest, if you want a project like for the church or something, to work with the grocery stores. I learned several years ago when I was doing something how much these stores throw away every day. And they don't tell anybody. And somebody told me, well, they're not even going to give it to the employees because they don't want the employees to get used to getting, free food or something like that. And it was absolutely shocking to see what they threw away every day. So if there's some way to work you at the stores to get this, I don't know. I mean, that probably would be a big project, but it would be good for everybody.
Well, that may be one of the actions that we could take as a team, to actually go around and see if we couldn't convince more large stores to do composting. Any last questions for Fritz? Fritz, thank you very, very much. You really have been terrific. Thank you. This is a virtual clap you're getting with Fritz.
Thank
Okay.
you.
While you're on, just very quickly,